There are two oceans in this setting, and one sky to watch them both. The first ocean wears the honest names: vacuum, gravity, fusion. Stone underfoot when a planet cools enough to pretend it is safe. It is the Materium, the physical universe that behaves with a reliability that poets call indifference and engineers call mercy. Its rules do not flatter hope. Stars are what happens when pressure refuses to apologize. Worlds are accidents with long memories. If you step off a cliff here, the physics that greet you will not pause to admire your courage. This is a kindness. Predictability is the first compassion large spaces can afford. The second ocean does not take compliments well. Call it the Immaterium, the Empyrean, the Warp. Names are the way frightened species try to teach storms manners. This is the medium of minds, a sea that thickens where emotion collects, where thought leaves wakes, where hatred carves trenches, and faith raises waves that can be surfed until they eat the surfer. Time here is not a promise, it is a suggestion, written with a trembling hand. Distance is a rumor that changes with witnesses. The first mistake newcomers make is to treat this sea as a metaphor. It will drown metaphors and keep their jewelry. In this sea, thought makes weather, and weather remembers. Between these oceans stretches a single sky, and under that sky, civilizations learn a rule they cannot repeal. You will live or die by the way you interface with both. The Materium is the house you can draw. The Immaterium is the weather that remembers your laughter. The clever find ways to use one to keep the other polite. The foolish insist on sailing through tempests because they have good flags. If you have only ever known engines, the warp seems like a theological prank, a road that moves while you are walking on it. If you have only ever known prayer, the Materium seems like a cruelty designed to starve hymns. Both reactions are provincial. The truth is older and more useful. The Materium is where you build. The warp is where your building picks up the scent of your intentions and begins to answer back. Consider a quiet world, early in its career. The night is just black. The air so young it tries to taste like stone. A ridge of cold basalt stares at a lake that has yet to agree to be a lake and not a mere suggestion of reflection. There is no song yet, no throats, no mouths. But if you could listen with instruments that register ache and curiosity, you would hear the Immaterium hum so lightly that even a cautious god would call it silence. Here, with nothing to be angry or in love, the warp is a docile mirror under muslin. Sentience is a contagion of attention. The first cells that teach themselves to be stubborn are not voices. The first fishes that notice a color and find the noticing useful have not invented adjectives, but the act of distinction, a thing recognizing that it is itself and not the water around it, is a kind of whisper. The Immaterium notices the whisper, the way a pond notices the first stone tossed by a bored child. Ripples, tiny, harmless, the sort of disturbance that teaches the surface to expect delight. When eyes open, the sea changes. There is wonder now and fear, and soon there will be grieving and revenge and currencies superior to calories. The Empyrean fattens, not at once, not with a villain's laugh. It thickens the way a room thickens when people who love each other are too tired to go on and keep going anyway. The air learns, that's all. Minds discover that thinking is not just for surviving rocks. It is for surviving the way stones have, of refusing to care about stories. The warp is superb with stories. It becomes hospitable to them. It begins to store them in coils and eddies as if it were keeping careful accounts in a wet ledger. Now civilizations train. Not armies, not yet. Interface. How do we speak to a sea that speaks back? How do we use a storm to arrive, where we mean without teaching the wind to expect our faces? One answer is ritual. Keep emotions in patterns so the currents cannot grab your ankles. Another is technology. Hull your ship in the kind of equations that make waves forget why they are angry. Another is refusal. Build roads that never touch the water. Each answer is a personality. Species become their answers. The Materium rewards patience and measurements. It is possible to live here with exquisite impersonality and call that virtue. The Immaterium rewards intensity and offers discounts to obsession. It is possible to live here on fire and call that enlightenment. The rare mature culture learns to keep manners in both places, to be precise where gravity is bored and modest where desire is sovereign. Most cultures remain teenagers. They try to look good in storms. When sages talk about the warp, they will say, "Thought makes weather," and they will be telling the truth in a tone that hopes you hear the warning. Hate is heavy. It sinks and drags. Faith is buoyant. It lifts badly at first, and then too much. Despair is slick. It makes ladders traitors. Joy is contagious. It breeds whirlpools where nobody wanted to dance. These are not metaphors for social media. They are navigational hazards on lanes older than regret. Your civilization will post charts, or it will post apologies. One of those choices leaves bones behind. Communities that prefer the Materium accuse the warp of drama. Communities that prefer the warp accuse the Materium of snobbery. Good pilots do not quarrel with water. They put in breakwaters and teach fishermen to come home on a schedule. Good engineers do not quarrel with the wind. They learn to put doors where drafts help rather than scold. Somewhere, very early, an old species understood that the trick is infrastructure. If the storm is inevitable, build rooms that do not teach it new tricks. If gravity is indifferent, lay floors that do not encourage pride to slip. Under this one sky, two oceans wait to be told who you are. The Materium will judge you by whether your bridges fall down. The Immaterium will judge you by whether you thought you were special while you were building them. Put simply, some futures die because their math was bad. Others die because their music was. The most beautiful empires die from both, often in the same week. The rest of this episode will pretend to be about ancient negotiations and old wrongs, and it will be. But remember this rule: when names arrive and start behaving like weather, civilizations thrive or fail by how they interface with both oceans. Every war we will cover is an argument about corridors, tempests, and manners. Begin earlier than patience enjoys. The first light is not a sunrise. It is pressure, finding its voice in a darkness that had no use for voices. Hydrogen makes an indecent proposal to gravity and agrees to burn for a very long time in exchange for existing. Stars are not born so much as negotiated into flames. They fill a sky the way confession fills a quiet room, slowly, then all at once, and never all the way. The Materium likes to reuse ideas. After stars, the next trick is dust that remembers. Worlds coalesce from the polite garbage of violent neighborhoods. Crusts cool, atmospheres try out moods. Waters fall in love with basins and are always the last to admit it. Chemistry gets ambitious. The first living things are accidents addicted to copying themselves badly. Most of those accidents die the way a joke dies when told to granite. Some cheat. Some learn to steal the sun. Some learn to complain about stealing the sun. Language is only a late symptom of a planet that has become vain. All this time, the second ocean is practicing patience. The Immaterium, when the universe is quiet, is like a rehearsal where the orchestra has not yet arrived and the conductor is a rumor. But the clandestine truth is that the orchestra never arrives. It grows. Each mind is a new instrument. Each fear is a new key. Each act of love adds a harmony that the sea tries to repeat by itself when nobody is listening. It is not evil yet, any more than a gust is treachery. It is appetite without vocabulary. Sentience scales weather. A single clever animal alters a local current. Ripples, nothing more. A city changes a coastline in the warp. An empire truly believed in by citizens and loved even by its enemies can create a prevailing wind. The cruel mathematics of mortality also apply here. As lives accumulate, so do the stories they refuse to relinquish. The Empyrean thickens. Tides appear. The first storms are not punishments. They are pressure systems learning to read. Space adopts its familiar tricks, brutal distances, unkind timescales, the smugness of light. If you want to go from one star to another without waiting for your bones to invent new names for patience, you must admit that the physical ocean will not permit it in the way your grandchildren deserve. So, species invent compromises. They learn to fold space in the same way a good liar folds a towel, neatly, with a smell of distortion that only bothers honest guests. They learn to slip into the Immaterium for shortcuts, to treat storms like bureaucracy, to be endured, manipulated, bribed with rituals, or they decide to avoid storms entirely and build elsewhere. Elsewhere is a superstition until it becomes an address. Somewhere very old begins to guide the pattern. We will name them in a later breath, but for this minute, keep your mind on the method, not the hands. The method is restraint, expressed as architecture. Do not sail the sea that can overhear your fear and start imitating it. Dig channels where the sea cannot reach. Teach doors to be boring. Reward walls that do not learn faces. If the Immaterium must be engaged, and it must because shortcuts are still the currency of empire, engage it with discipline that makes obsession unprofitable. At first, this kind of wisdom looks like cowardice to cultures that like banners. But banners teach the warp songs that are too easy to sing, and it will hum them back to you with harmonies you did not ask for. The ancient hands we are not naming yet learned to convert bravery into zoning laws. Across young galaxies, they seeded biospheres that would not bankrupt a mind. They taught fledgling psychics to put emotion in cupboards and label it accurately. They put gates in places where storms were already tired and taught those gates to refuse compliments. Their method was restraint expressed as infrastructure, resilience, psychic compatibility, connectivity, so storms would have nothing new to learn. The Materium did not notice this work except to find it pleasant to live near. Bridges that do not fall down call no meetings. The Immaterium noticed and sulked. A sea thrives on improvisation and gossip. Corridors smell like accountants. But the warp is also a fan of etiquette when it is practiced with talent. The first networks that refused to rattle invited respect even from tempests. Currents parted around manners the way bullies part around someone who knows where the principal keeps her patience. Meanwhile, other intelligences discovered other paths. Some trusted the sea too much and built religions out of weather. Some trusted the stone too much and built stones out of religion. Machines with manners, but no pity. A few discovered that you can live well if you teach grief to keep office hours and joy to use coasters. These would become the species with long shadows. Somewhere under a killing star that made life short, a people began counting refusals. On some poison day, on some unfortunate world, a child looked up and felt something look back. The Materium does not do this. The Immaterium does it casually. On that world, and 1,000 like it, the first myths were written as hazard labels. Do not swim where the color of the water looks like your mother's last argument. Do not sing the songs that taste like metal. Do not go out in the fog if you are still angry at your brother. The warnings were clumsy, but they were science in a dialect that forgave ignorance. Later, worse warnings would become scripture. Scripture is just a label that learned to glare. Now the stage is dressed for the behavior that will ruin or rescue people. The difference between a gate and a hole is not merely engineering, it is ethics writ into architecture. A hole invites weather to come inside and try your pantry. A gate is a contract with storms that says, you may pass here, and you will forget that we exist. Elsewhere becomes not a hope, but a habit. The old hands sketch a lattice, teach apprentices, give doors chores, retire corridors that start humming as if anyone important had walked through them. In this quiet age of colossal patience, mistakes are still made. A culture in love with its own music might open a balcony and sing at the sea. The sea learns the chorus and sells it back to them in a key that cancels funerals. Another culture, in love with its own engines, might anchor bridges so heavy that even gravity's flattery is not enough to keep them modest. Those bridges begin to believe in themselves and insist on processions. The old hands retire such bridges. They do not publish the minutes of those meetings. If you are impatient for names, you already see why names are dangerous. Proper nouns collect weather. The moment you christen an idea with a mouth-friendly syllable, the immaterium begins to condense around it like mist on anything warm. This does not mean anonymity is virtue. It means that institutions with long lives learn to keep their nicknames in kitchens and their policies in public, where policies can be bored into reliability. But the universe is not composed solely of prudent gardeners. Somewhere else, a species learns to turn suffering into a thesis. Somewhere under a killing star that made life short, a people began counting refusals. Under a star that hates its children, a people count their dead and decide that any house that denies them a door is an enemy. We will go there in a later segment. For now, it is enough to know that cosmogenesis is not just geology scaling up into scenery. It is etiquette learning to keep a civil tongue in seas that listen. It is old patience writing a map for young impatience. It is two oceans rehearsing the song that will one day be called history without ever agreeing on the melody. The first negotiations between builders and weather are conducted without witnesses. A seam hums in a way that tells a steward the gate is beginning to enjoy itself. The steward retires it. A river of feeling tries to jump a channel. A priest of maintenance adds a baffle and bans festivals on Thursdays. Elsewhere, a world learns to dream too loudly, and a path across its sky forgets how to be quiet. The old hands draw another path with more corners and fewer compliments. These are the minutes of the first Senate that mattered, the parliament of corridors and storms. As sentience spreads, the Empyrean grows crowded. What was once an empty theater becomes a market that refuses to decide whether it sells bread or knives. Predators that live on patterns begin to hunt. Not bodies yet, not in the crude sense of claw and tooth, but they learn to savor the flavor of certain tunes. Entire regions of the sea begin to smell like defeat because too many species have agreed that is what defeat should smell like. Hope, stubborn as a child with a favorite toy, invents new recipes for skies. The ocean breathes along with them, shivering the way a lung does when asked to play an instrument for which it was never paid. On the physical side, stars age, some with grace, some with the kind of rage that throws furniture. Worlds tidy their cradles or fail to, and we keep only the ones that outlived embarrassment. Life invents politics. Politics invents distance. Distance invents desire. Desire, rehearsed badly, invents catastrophes with good hair. The old hands watch the tide tables and add railings. The young cultures scrawl hearts on the railings and complain about splinters. The railings are the only reason complaining remains a hobby instead of a vocabulary for headstones. At last, the story we are telling inches toward nouns. It is acceptable now to say that someone sees a pattern and decides to guide it, not by speeches, but by fixtures, through ways that do not let weather sit down. It is acceptable to say that early on, someone learned that minds make weather and that the only decent response is to keep minds from teaching storms flamboyance. It is safer than it used to be to say old ones and mean not saints, but engineers of life who thought in rooms, not in amphitheaters. Their greatest praise is that they built so well that even gratitude learned to speak softly. Their method was restraint, expressed as infrastructure, resilience, psychic compatibility, connectivity, so storms would have nothing new to learn. They did not smooth every sea. They could not. The warp is not the enemy, it is the other ocean. If you treat it like a monster, it will dress the part out of spite. If you treat it like a colleague, it will attend your meetings, like weather attends picnics. The old ones aspired to collegiality with climate. Their descendants will disagree on how well they achieved it. For our purposes here, it will suffice to say that they guided the pattern as gardeners guide an aggressive vine, with trellises, pruning, and a refusal to turn pruning into opera. The last sentences of this segment are always tempted to make promises. Do not let them. The history to come will have names that behave like tides. Wars will acquire appetites. Doors will think themselves special and demand parades. We will meet a people who lived under a killing sky and mistook refusal for contempt, because that is what grief does when given a bureaucracy. We will meet hungers old as the first star that learned to gossip, and we will see what happens when someone offers those hungers a body and a schedule. But for now, hold the map in your head. 2 oceans, 1 sky. Matter that keeps its vows, and a sea that keeps your secrets only if you keep them from teaching its songs. Somewhere very old guiding the pattern, somewhere very proud. Deciding patterns are for the comfortable. The rest follows. They did not arrive with trumpets. They arrived as policy. In an age when most species were still learning that a promise kept is more useful than a poem remembered, something old took a clipboard to the stars. 1 million young biospheres were tugging at their atmospheres like children with new coats. The Immaterium was beginning to test its own charisma. The physical universe, polite and pitiless, continued its work of pretending to be simple. Into this laboratory came engineers whose genius was neither conquest nor sermon, but maintenance. They were gardeners who refused to let the rain learn their names. In a 2-ocean cosmos, thought makes weather, and weather remembers. We will call them the Old Ones, because that is what the galaxy with its bad habit of turning roles into proper nouns, eventually decided to call them. For the space of a few minutes, try to hear the role before the name. Their brief was not domination. Their brief was survivability at scale. They wrote the brief in 3 clauses that look modest until you realize everything terrifying in history is what happens when one of them is neglected. First, resilience against warp volatility. Teach minds to inhabit a universe with 2 oceans without drowning in the one made of thought. Second, psychic compatibility, so a civilization's inner weather would not unravel its outer scaffolding, so the Empyrean would be coaxed into manners rather than courted into melodrama. Third, connectivity, not merely the speed of going, but the quality of going. Paths through elsewhere that do not invite the sea to become a gossip columnist about travelers. Where young species made altars, the old ones drew up service schedules. Where prophets tried to speak to storms, they taught doors to forget faces. And where ambition construed distance as an affront to be avenged, they built corridors that made distance irrelevant while keeping weather polite. If you are tempted to call this cowardice, you have never kept a lighthouse in a world where the fog can learn songs. Begin with resilience. The warp was already learning to be interesting. Thought makes weather. Weather remembers. And what it remembers, it begins to teach. A people who laugh too loudly teach the sea to expect jokes that kill. A people who grieve without measure teach the sea to pull them under whenever memory loosens its hair. The old ones responded not with censorship, but with containers. Society itself becomes a container when built by people who like chores more than cheers. Emotions are not renounced, they are scheduled. The first curriculum these engineers wrote was a pedagogy of temperature, how to be hot in kitchens and cool in corridors, how to sing at home and hum in public, how to let love be scandalous without allowing it to leak into lanes where storms learn lyrics. Harmonized minds can build the same bridges storms prefer. Discipline keeps those bridges from carrying the wrong traffic. On one humid moon, where the air made amateurs of lungs, an apprentice steward stood before a small congregation and taught the first civic sacrament, keep the gate boring. The text was practical. If the door never thinks it's important, the wind won't develop opinions about it. If the wind never develops opinions, it won't invite friends with adjectives. If it never invites friends, your grandchildren will inherit a house that is still a house. A child asked if it was allowed to decorate. The steward said yes, but in kitchens, where decorations don't teach doors to acquire personality. Resilience is sometimes mistaken for severity. The old ones learned early that a cheerful law is obeyed longer than a beautiful suggestion. In cities they tended, you could eat festivals like bread at home. In public rooms, feet learned the cadence of indifference. Indifference here meant not cruelty, but discretion. When an empire is young, it must practice the courtesy of not making the weather feel clever. The greatest invention of this civilization was not a weapon, not even a road. It was indifference as policy, the disciplining of public surfaces so that storms never saw themselves in the shine. Next, psychic compatibility. If resilience is the art of refusing to teach sea new tricks, compatibility is the craft of designing minds that refuse to trick themselves. The old ones did not believe that a people could be trained entirely out of ruinous intensities, hate, rapture, despair, but they did score those emotions for safer instruments. Think of the earliest paths, not as commandments, but as practices that keep virtuosity from turning public rooms into concerts the warp cannot resist joining. A hunter learns to hunt as if the forest is allergic to applause. A poet learns to handle words with gloves when composing in the street. Apprentices at gates learn to love their own skill in places the door cannot eavesdrop. On a low-gravity world with rivers that slouch like tired cats, the old ones sponsored a school where the first lesson was naming without claiming. A teacher placed a rock on the table and asked the children to describe it in ways that would not teach the rock to believe in itself. The game became a culture. 1,000 years later, that world's ports suffered fewer hauntings than its neighbors. It is easy to laugh at superstitions. It is harder to recognize 1,000 little disciplines written into habits until you see a culture's ships sail home with crew whose dreams still run in straight lines. Compatibility was not only a matter of etiquette. A mind shape is the first architecture a civilization builds. The old ones trained minds to develop baffles, structured ways to route intensity into useful channels, grief into ritual, ritual into kindness, kindness into architecture, architecture into travel, travel into silence, where silence is a gift. A student who learned to fall out of a tantrum without losing face would someday become a port steward who could close a humming seam without teaching it to expect drama. The sea notices everything. It learns from tantrums. It learns more from tantrums in public uniform. The compatibility program, if you require plain language, was about humbling uniforms. Finally, connectivity. Without travel, empathy becomes folklore, and commerce becomes robbery. The old ones did not regard speed as the sole virtue of travel. Speed is easy to flatter into impertinence. It teaches corridors to feel exquisite. Exquisite corridors teach storms to flirt. What they pursued, what they built, is the quality of going. We will defer the mechanical particulars to the next episode when we speak of gates and their geometry. But it must be said now that the old ones' roads were not simply shortcuts. They were manners, operationalized. Elsewhere became a civic virtue rather than a miracle. You arrived clean because the path refused to keep your scent. In the records we still have, some carved into materials that hate vanity, some recited by stewards whose training was to forget themselves elegantly, you can hear the connectivity doctrine like a metronome. Doors must open on schedule. Corridors must not hum. Corners are better than vistas. Junctions must retire before they think themselves indispensable. People who use doors must not congratulate doors. This is how doors become a danger. If you feel an emotion you are proud of, keep it in your pocket until you are home among the faces that can forgive you. This is not joyless. This is how joy survives the weather. Let us watch them at work, since watching is the only praise they permit. On a hillside designed to be unremarkable, a pair of builders lay a lintel with more patience than it seems to deserve. One of them whispers the rule that protects civilizations from accidents. No corridor may be the most interesting thing in a room. The other nods and locates the humming seam. Not because the seam is dramatic, but because it is trying to be. The seam will be retired, and another will be grown a few paces left, where the room is uglier and therefore safe. The seam will not be mourned. Mourning would teach it was once worthy of a song. On an equatorial port, where the air thinks about breaking into storms the way thieves think about breaking into song, an inspector cites a steward for being too deft at refusal. The gate had begun to enjoy saying no. Elegance is a solvent in the wrong hallway. The steward is reassigned to a place where clumsiness will be a virtue. This is not a punishment. it is a theology. In this church, beautiful refusals are heresies because they educate thresholds about their mouths. On a river world, colonized by people who could not break the habit of believing in their own sadness, the old ones installed not a shrine, but an accounting office. The book with the polite spine recorded which songs were sung in which rooms. Too many public songs of a certain intensity, and the office would redirect festivals to kitchens, where songs become soups, and soups do not teach bridges to enjoy admiration. The citizens were not happy until they noticed they were alive, and happiness discovered it could afford to be modest. If this sounds like bureaucracy with delusions of sainthood, that is because all saintly bureaucracies begin as courtesies written down. The old one's mastery was administrative precisely because administration is how you teach generations to succeed without having to meet heroes. The galaxies where heroes are necessary are always very beautiful and always very temporary. We should address the temptation to worship. If you build doors that do not rattle and gardens that do not drown, someone will call you a god. The old ones were allergic to this. Worship cultivates theatrical weather. The sea cannot resist a stage. When their work forced them to be visible, they spoke in the diction of audits. We changed the schedule. We retired a corridor. We seeded an ecosystem with an animal that finds rituals irritating and therefore keeps fishermen honest. If they received gifts, they forwarded them to kitchens or used them to add baffles to a hallway. Kitchen glory is the only kind that does not teach storms a vocabulary for envy. Uplift is the work most likely to be misunderstood in later centuries. The old ones did create and uplift carefully at scales staggered against the weather, because resilience also means diversity of solutions. On a planet where gravity insisted on melodrama, they bred a grazer whose hunger scythed down problem plants that caused dreams to become local political parties. On a world where skies loved to imitate grief, they sharpened a predator's instincts so festivals learned to conclude before storms arrived. This is not myth. This is ecology as conflict prevention. And yes, they also taught mines, not to adore them. This was policed with a zeal that in other civilizations would have qualified as vanity, but to survive. The earliest stewards of what would later harden into path discipline were taught to put feeling into compartments without cruelty. You do not rip a violin out of a child's hand because the warp loves violinists. You teach the child to practice where doors cannot overhear. If this breeds a reputation for coldness, keep the reputation and let families keep their children. We must be honest about addition deltas in the record. In some tellings, these engineers made the first roads outright. In others, they discovered and operationalized an existing elsewhere, then taught a successor civilization to master and maintain it. In either telling, the ethic is the same: insulation without arrogance, travel without applause, a lattice that respects the sea by refusing to teach it theater. Our next episode will sketch the geometry and the guilds. For now, keep the principle. Corridors must not become characters. You may ask how an ethic so devoted to not being dramatic intends to survive first contact with those who prefer to enforce their existence violently. The answer is that these engineers were not pacifists. They practiced strategic boredom as a weapon. In a cluster of stars that fancied itself a choir, they introduced a species of auditors who could drain applause from a room. Armies prefer to march through applause. When applause departs, the army's appetite finds famine. The old ones understood that in a two-ocean cosmos, the most dangerous addiction is to attention. They cured it with unremarkable rooms. They were not naive about predators. To say more here would smash our own policy about naming appetites too early, but the brief should reassure you. The old ones prepared against hungers that can learn. They built learning-proof corridors. They trained stewards who punished their own elegance. They seeded cultures with a bias for risk management over romance. On a dangerous map, romance is a lovely spice and a terrible fuel. Where romance flowered in public, they trimmed. Where romance fermented in kitchens, they called it heritage and kept it very safe. Connectivity deserves one more pass, because connectivity is where civilizations most often betray themselves. There are two wrong ways to travel: to make the journey a shrine to yourself, and to make the destination a punishment for those who stayed home. The old ones discovered the third way: polite corridors. These do not flatter travelers, they do not gossip about them, they do not add perfume to rooms. They are the civil service of motion. Their stations are dull by design. Their clocks do not learn pride. If a junction begins to collect stories, it is retired. Retirements are mourned in kitchens as a human courtesy, but not in public, lest the sea notice that mourning can be fashionable. On a basalt plain, scorched by a star that could not stop bragging, a crew finished a path that would let farmers cross a mountain in 5 quiet minutes. There was a ceremony scheduled and then cancelled. The cancellation was the ceremony. The farmers walked the path and arrived less tired than they would have been, and because nobody applauded the door did not learn to expect applause. In 500 years, that path would be relocated 3 degrees to the north to remain boring. The crew that made the relocation died without their names on a plaque. A steward kept the names in a book that would never be read by a wall. If this is beginning to feel like a liturgy, that is accurate. The old one's cult, if you insist on the word, was a cult of function. They tended redundancies the way other civilizations tend fires. They taught that a room without witnesses is the room that keeps a city from catching religion from itself. They admired crafts that could be performed so well the performance did not leave fingerprints. They wrote oaths in fonts that walls could not learn. They handed out medals for not letting your tools develop personalities. The medals were stored privately like contraband sweets. When they seeded an uplift, they did not create gods, they cultivated colleagues. Adjust a nervous system here to make group ritual less narcotic. Alter a gene there so that boredom becomes a survival mechanism rather than a crisis. These are mundane interventions, but in sums, they teach a civilization to keep its storms in glass jars with proper labels, and always an exit policy. If a corridor begins to enjoy itself, if a steward begins to enjoy refusal, if a city begins to enjoy the way its public rooms make visitors stand straighter, retire, reassess, relocate. This is the discipline that keeps doors from turning into stages. None of this prevented tragedy. The old ones were not gods, they were professionals. Professionalism can be unpopular, and mannered construction breeds a certain kind of resentment in the young. There is always a people under a killing sky counting refusals, their own, the universe's, and those of any civilization too busy to explain its policies. The old ones did explain when asked, but explanation lacks the charisma of grievance. Grievance will find a god to punish doors, or failing that, it will build one out of starlight and audacity. That is a story for a later episode. For now, it is enough to recognize how the engineering of survival can read to neighbors like arrogance committed politely. If you require a single sentence to remember, carry this. Their method was restraint, expressed as infrastructure, resilience, psychic compatibility, connectivity, so storms would have nothing new to learn. Everything else is a footnote to habits that prevent oceans from learning your name. We promise not to linger on the details of the roads. We keep that promise, but we can stand on a balcony the old ones would disapprove of and look down at the map. It is not a grid. Grids provoke pride. It is a braided set of habits built into geographies that prefer not to posture. There are confluences so quiet that poets forget to exist. There are retirements so deft that archaeologists argue not about purpose, but about whether purpose ever lived there. There are annexes grown and then ungrown when the weather tried to court them. There are distant doors that have learned to be bad hosts and are therefore good neighbors. When later peoples remembered the old ones, they did so in two unhelpful ways. As gods, they could blame for not being dads, or as tyrants who posted too many signs about not singing in the stairwell. The truth is more domestic and more demanding. These were the custodians who learned to convert love into railings. Railings do more for the future than love poems left in public rooms. The poems belong in kitchens. The railings belong where gravity practices treachery. It is proper now to foreshadow without betraying our own schedule. The old ones built a network across realities, a webway, as later stewards and heirs will call it, that made elsewhere into an ethic. We will walk its halls in the next segment and teach their maintenance the way a careful aunt teaches knives. For this moment, understand that the webway was less a marvel than a refusal to teach the sea how to be a road, a refusal to let admiration be a currency of travel, a refusal to let storms imagine themselves civil servants. In a universe that will later interpret every refusal as insult, a civilization once managed to make refusal into hospitality. It told storms, "You are beautiful where you are." It told gravity, "Thank you for being dull." It told doors, "Be forgetful." It told kitchens, "Be loud." It told children, "Keep your songs where doors cannot overhear." It told auditors, "Fine yourselves when you feel elegant." It told calendars, "Keep secrets." And it told itself, when applause approaches like weather, retire the corridor and add 2 corners. This is the design brief. Everything that follows in our history is either fidelity to it or betrayal. Their sky was not blue. It was a document. Some worlds raise children on horizons that invite. The Necrontyr home star was an indictment with light attached. Its gift was radiation that arrived like a habit. Its seasons were a cruelty practiced politely. Doses were counted the way other cultures count birthdays, and birthdays were not things one expected many of. Lifespans ran thin, measured in handfuls of decades at best, and policy learned to speak before poetry. You can tell a civilization by the furniture it keeps in the mind. The Necrontyr kept ledgers where other peoples keep songs. Begin with the weather report that never changed enough, flares that learned to be punctual, storms that learned patience, a spectrum with appetites for lungs, marrow, and the soft parts of the eye that teach a child to trust colors. The wind did not caress. It filed complaints against skin. The ground, when it took a mind off the sky, did so only to suggest basements. A city built for such a star is a set of behaviors before it is a set of walls. Shade is not comfort, it is law. Doors are not invitations, they are instruments. And medicine is not a profession, it is a civic religion whose saints wear dosimeter beads around their wrists and say their prayers over Geiger counters. Short lives make certain virtues scarce and certain habits precious. There are places where patience is a luxury. Under a killing sky, patience was the sacrament that kept numbers honest. The child who dared the light learned to count penalties before vocabulary learned politeness. Schoolrooms trained wrists to lay gauze with the dexterity of thieves. Everyone, at some point, would need to know how to bandage brightness. Eyes grew fluent in the indecent color of a legion's edge. Apprenticeships began with the sentence, "We will keep your skin if we can," and proceeded without drama, because drama excites storms. Synchronized minds are easy bridges for storms. Discipline keeps those bridges carrying the right traffic. The word Necrontyr carries a cold music in other languages. Death people, grave folk. This is an artifact of the future and a misapprehension of the past. They were not death-loving, they were death-literate. They knew the shapes of endings, the schedules of endings, the paperwork of endings. They knew how to tuck an ending into a pocket so that endings would not feel too proud and multiply. Their art, when they permitted it, favored the steady geometry of shelter, lintels that instructed light to reconsider, vaults whose arcs taught echoes to be brief, corridors that did not indulge footsteps into believing they were important. Outdoors was a rumor accommodated by necessity. Work crews moved between shadows with a choreography that would later be mistaken for austerity. It was mercy. "Stand there," a foreman would say, with a precision born from funerals. "Not there," a mother would say, and the floor would learn humility under the weight of her urgency. Tape measured not merely distances, but exposures. From window to window, there is a minute and 8 seconds of argument with the sun. Wear your argument like clothing, and do not let it grow eloquent. Endemic sickness does not merely weaken the body, it drafts the imagination into triage. Children learned what fevers teach, which is arithmetic, and they learned it sideways. How many breaths to a bandage? How many heartbeats to an injection? How many paces to the safe stair when the sky begins telling jokes? There were jokes the sky told, peculiar luminous moods in which the air flirted with skin and then punished civilians for believing in tenderness. An entire grammar of distrust grew upright from that flirtation. Cultures elsewhere likened trust to warmth. Here, trust was the right angle of a brace, the modesty of a shutter that refused to learn to enjoy applause. If you met kindness in a Necrontyr city, it would be in a kitchen, under heavy cloth, behind 2 doors, after a ritual of hand-washing that stripped the day from your palms. There are 2 great ways to respond to such a parent star. One is to become bitter and small. The other is to become dangerous to problems. The Necrontyr chose the second, and then the first, when the second failed to teach the sun respect. Their scientists were not the kind that end up in statues for dramatic equations. They were the kind who check seals. They learned physics the way millers learn flour, in its dust, in its moods, in the way it resists being told it has clumped. They learned astronomy with a piety that would have embarrassed shrines. Under a sky that wrote deaths with light, the adult thing to do was to write counter-instructions into walls and calendars. The calendars were a literature. You could read in them where a city had learned to argue with the sky without raising its voice. Months were not named after heroes. Months were named after tolerances. Days, the ones not already rented by funerals, were rented by maintenance. The most sentimental holidays were devoted to wheels that failed to squeak because someone had loved them in time. children played radiant hide and seek, where the seeker could only walk through safe zones noted by old chalk. There was a rule that chalk must be ugly, because beautiful chalk educates stones into believing politics. The inhabitants, pharaons and paupers alike, dressed like rooms, robes in colors that did not tempt light into cleverness, veils that were engineering first and fashion only as a side effect, amulets that were not charms but commemorative instruments, a dose badge that had saved a life once, an optic filter inherited from a grandmother who had known exactly how to make a dusk out of a noon. Vanity existed, but in private rooms where vanity could not teach walls. Lace happened, but it was attached to cuffs that already had serious work to do. The dignity of such a people is easy to mistake for cruelty. They fined themselves for tone. If you made refusal sound like art at a doorway, your supervisor would send you to a windowless duty for a week. If you praised a gate for being beautiful, you were assigned to sandpaper posts until your compliments learned to be practical. A state that requires its citizens to be aesthetically cautious can breed resentments in young hearts that want to shine like knives. Those young hearts later grew into tools that could cut space along its arteries. But that is a later story. In this hour of their history, knives were used for opening bandages and cutting bread behind 6 layers of curtain. The sciences grew toward longevity, like vines searching a trellis in mean weather. Physicians were half engineers, surgeons were half architects. The best among the cryptech-to-be, we use the noun with caution this early, were children who could hear a machine tell the truth and make it tell it more quietly. Orders of scholars catalogued cancers the way other cultures catalogued birds, by color, by behavior, by which windows made them bold. Cataloging is a form of love, and they loved their enemies because that love purchased time. Laboratories learned to be humble, or the sun would correct them. Anyone who has worked in a close machine shop will recognize the mood. Respect that looks like superstition. Superstition that turns out to be correct. There were early attempts at cheating the star. Some were municipal, belts of mirror and soot that conspired to scold light into lateness. Cities that wore roofs like apologetic mountains. There were domes that persuaded the sky to find other targets and shafts that led the overconfident outdoors, under the ground where prudence could discipline it. Some attempts were personal. Masks that pretended to be uninteresting. Salves that taught a cheek to be glass without teaching glass to admire itself. The very poor learned to need less sun. The very rich learned to hire shade with tails who could be punished if the light learned to talk through them. Subterranean life is an intimacy with geology that leaves a taste of honesty on the tongue. Tunnels do not admire speeches, they respect steps. The Necrontyr burrowed into their world, not as an act of cowardice, but as a refusal to argue with physics in public. Cities developed undercrofts with air that smelled like stone that has learned to listen. Workrooms kept clocks whose ticks were not for schedules, but for moods. If a clock ticked that way, the scene behind it was preparing an inconvenient remark. The right countersong could keep seams shy. Under that ground, life extended by careful increments. A new generation that saw 10 more springs than the last learned to call itself fortunate without teaching springs to expect thank yous. But longevity remained a war fought on the wrong front. The sun still held the treaty in its hostile hand. Something else had to be attempted, something strategic, something that would pull the theater out from under the sky entirely. So they built ships. Not the sly, frictionless miracles that later civilizations would reserve for hymns to speed, but earnest machines that turned every kilometer into a committee meeting. Lifespans at war with distances make logistics a theology. If your grandchildren will die before they see the second moon, make a ship into a hospital and a school and a courthouse and an accountant's desk. The first Necrontyr starships were unloved by stories because stories have a weakness for elegance. These craft were procedural. They worked because every bolt had a testimony that could be recited as bedtime. They failed often because time prefers to eat those who measure it. Generation craft do not flatter, they drain. Imagine loving a family that must die so that a later family can argue with a star that will never hear their names. Imagine loving a table more than a season because the table will outlive you by a day and hold the signatures of your work. Imagine a society whose greatest poems are daily logs. Those logs exist in rooms too deep for light to gossip about, engraved into alloys that refuse eloquence. Elsewhere, poets made lyric out of victory. In this house, lyric was written into the minutes of a meeting where an air filter needed to be replaced. They did not expand benignly. Wars of secession were not a phase, but a metabolism. Dynasts with better roofs and longer clinics waged policy against neighbors whose roofs and clinics were older by one regulation. Entire districts seceded from exposure schedules. Some built shade baronies, selling hours like smugglers sell fireworks. Others engineered contempt into their calendars and refused the discipline that protected children's eyes. The Triarch, an office that invented its own dignity by never turning it into style, spent centuries fining itself for not having explained better and finding provinces for having pretended not to understand. Many died while arguments kept their dignity and forgot to keep the air clean. In these internal wars, a talent culture matured. Those who could design a corridor that taught light to use its indoor voice. Those who could interpose a filter between a crowd and an idol. Those who could make a door refuse compliments in such a way that the crowd kept loving what the door protected instead. The cadre later remembered as the Triarch Praetorians polished their restraint in this mess. Their art was not killing. Any fool can kill in a city that close to the sun, but pausing. Pause is expensive under a killing sky. It was taught by a breed of officer who counted breaths against budgets. And out of this domestic liturgy of triage, one obsession gained the right to be called a purpose: escape. Not escape in the vulgar sense of running away, but escape in the engineering sense of changing the frame of the problem. Every lab question was a prayer to that grammar. What if the conversation with the sun could be conducted behind glass? What if seasons could be rendered as local preferences? What if smiles could satirize the sky's threats by refusing to train skin to imitate influence? What if there is a place where light has never learned to be a bully? Their astronomers were the first to answer, not with maps, but with attitudes. They pointed instruments at stars, as if they were auditors, not lovers. When you watch light with that kind of posture, it confesses to appetites it hides from romantics. They learned that some stars age like thieves and some like librarians, that some call insects to windows and some teach windows to burn their own frames, that some would be neighborhoods and some would be wars. A people who had lived inside a war with a star knew the difference when they saw it. Charts were drawn that rated starlight not merely by color and intensity, but by how prone it was to personality. Planets were flagged as either therapists or bad influences. The galaxy began to look like a set of rooms, and rooms can be talked into manners. As their charts grew granular, so did their grief. Distances are insult when your average life has to be compressed into a ledger. There were expeditions that limped back with wonderful news and no survivors. There were colonists who sent a note that the sky here is almost honest, and then ran out of the kind of luck that keeps notes from becoming last sentences. The homeworld's plazas, such as they were, really just intersections with more shade, learned to host commemorations that refused to educate the air. No banners, no song, no long speeches, just names spoken as if they were instructions not to give up. Children learned to recite names in voices built for indoor use. Politically, the shape that emerges from such an ache is both severe and fair. Law exists to apportion shade. Shade is the bathing of a people in mercy, and therefore must be rationed like oxygen. The Triarch's seniority took on the color of fate simply because someone had to adjust the umbrellas. Pharaons governed because markets for seasons must be managed by people trained to not like profit too much. Every office wrote its own quiet oath. I will not teach thresholds to enjoy the weight of my hand. The oath violated itself when men were clever in public. They punished themselves with office hours and thought it mercy. All the while, the laboratories continued. Yesterday's cleverness became today's rigging. Tomorrow's rumor was shaped into protocol, while children held their breath with the discipline that makes other cultures think of dance. New materials were coaxed from old metals until the metals confessed they would like to behave like memory. This is how exotic alloys were born, not from a desire to make immortal statues, but from a desire to ask a wall to remember pressure without teaching it to expect hands. It was possible then to imagine bodies that were not bodies, not yet, not for people, but instruments that could remember in a cleaner way than meat remembers. The word necrodermis had not yet broken the surface of polite vocabulary, but the appetite for durable memory had. In another house, this would be the section of a museum dedicated to culture, and docents would mention art and food. The Necrontyr had art, function made so precisely it refused to look like a boast, and food that tasted like survival. Better exhibits would show textiles that seduce light into leaving skin alone, ceramics that reject contamination without teaching bacteria to revolt with style, cutlery that can be cleaned without water, because water is a currency and must be treated like a treaty partner. There were lullabies, but they were math, and they were hummed against a child's temple, while someone checked the window for honesty. Do not imagine that love was absent. It learned here to carry tools. Lovers exchanged instruments, filters and clamps, and devices that would be illegal in later, softer states. A morning gift might be a badge with an algorithm that warned a wearer when the sky was lying with the same facial expression it used the last time. A wedding might be permitted the extravagance of a ribbon that had never seen the outdoors. Parents pressed children's hands into the old posture. Fingers taught the shape of a latch that would not betray them. Love is what gave the city its grudging charm, even if charm was a private mischief conducted between people who lied to the weather about how little they mattered to each other. In places like this, religion swerves. Gods that cannot enforce shade are not of interest. Superstition turns into protocol. Protocol turns into ethics. Ethics turns into infrastructure. There were still superstitions, of course. Little rules that carried no science but great comfort. Walk counterclockwise when you can. It confuses certain flares. Carry a pebble in your left pocket on long trips. It tells your body that small gravity can be loved. Never name a window. These are jokes told by people who don't have time to die. Their power is that they keep the hands busy and the heart inside the ribs where it belongs. From such a culture, embassies do not sprout ambassadors as much as they export minutes. What they sent to neighbors were requests, written in a hand that had learned not to teach paper to enjoy handwriting. Share the paths, share the cures, share the rooms you built where storms forget themselves. We will pay in the only currency anyone ever truly owns: obedience to schedules. When refusal came back, polite, principled, alien, it had the taste it still has in their language: salt and metal. Children were taught the most useful sentence a free person ever learned: count refusals. This counting was not vengeance, it was training for policy. Those minutes became the language of their embassies, and so they studied escape from the sun, from mortality, from the statistical insult that children must bury parents before their laughter grows to the appropriate depth. Study here did not mean licking mysteries with vanity. It meant schedules and screws. It meant teaching light to behave without teaching it that it had behaved. It meant making corridors that resembled the dream of a safe childhood and then forbidding those corridors from using that resemblance to corrupt people into admiration. It meant 1,000 unpoetic things that no civilization that loves theatrics can bear to teach its apprentices. It meant the survival of a mood that refused to worship problems, even when the problem was the sky. What does a killing sky make of such people? It despises and respects them in equal measure. The flares leaned against their roofs and found their receipts in order. The storms tried to enter their schools and found that hallways knew how to shore up truth against hysteria. The spectrum changed the taste of their soups, and their soups changed the taste of grief. You can tell when a people are going to last longer than statistics because their kitchens learn to discipline colors. The Necrontyr kitchens were underfunded miracles. There is a sentence you must carry out of this room if you intend to follow them into worse rooms. They were not born cruel. They were born in the kind of place that makes kindness go to work in a uniform and pretend to be a pencil. When later horrors adopt their name and wear it like a clean suit that never learned to soil, it is easy to forget the people who invented hand-washing as a sacrament and silence as a gift to walls. They did not yet dream of immortality as a right. They dreamed of immortality as the right to finish a story at breakfast. Still, obsession lays a shape on dreams. Longevity obsession is the most understandable lust in the universe and the most expensive. It improves gloves before it ruins kindness. It trains stewards before it trains tyrants. It teaches rooms before it teaches appetites that refuse to apologize. We will not step past the line we drew for this episode. We will not take appetite out of its wrapper and turn it into a character that will eat a galaxy. But you can smell it here. You can smell its schedule. The laboratories are putting out milk for something that has not yet learned how to purr. The Necrontyr stood under their sky and did not ask for pity. They asked for parts and rules. They wrote a literature of receipts and a music of bandwidth, and made these into a religion whose shrine was a table that did not wobble. They taught their children to treat doors like shy cousins, and the sun like a distant uncle who must not be left alone with anyone. They sewed pockets into robes and filled them with quiet tools. They trained auditors to love boredom as if it were a person. They counted refusals. They counted breaths. They counted years in a way that did not break their hearts until new numbers came back from exploration and broke them anyway. By the time the embassies failed, by the time the good answers did not come, by the time the ledgers of petitions and denials tallied to a fury that smelled like law, the Necrontyr had built the only thing that makes war survivable, a habit of work. Their engineers did not know they would be required to become priests of the unacceptable. Their surgeons did not know they would be asked to invent bodies that taught skin to be a policy. Their children did not know that counting refusals was the first chapter in a cosmology. They knew only what all wounded adults know, that mornings must be made hospitable for anyone who wakes up inside them. We stop here, under the document sky, with hands that smell like metal and medicine, with corridors whose best virtue is their boredom, with a people who have made their grief into an instrument, and their instrument into a schedule. We do not ask you to love them. We ask you to learn their posture. You will need it. The next rooms are louder. Begin with a door that refuses to learn anyone's name. The day the embassies went up, the Necrontyr made their city even duller on purpose. Curtains were doubled. Praise was bled out of public places with the indecent mercy their auditors had invented. Drain compliments, keep the corridors unmusical, so that history could take notes without teaching the walls to enjoy being witnesses. Couriers with hands, trained to carry minutes like medicine, moved between shade and shade. The letter of petition had been copied onto material that did not gleam. It arrived at the Triarch's desk in a sleeve designed to be forgotten by furniture. Somewhere a child rehearsed the sentence every adult was practicing in their wrists. Keep your voice indoors. The ask was clean because dirt teaches storms to gossip. Share the paths, share the cures, share a way out. Share, not steal. Petition, not demand. It was written in the diction of a civilization that has learned to be polite to physics and therefore expects lawyers from the universe. A portfolio accompanied it, charts of cancers that behaved like weather, transport logs from generation ships that measured hope in filter changes, mortality curves that refused to perform but still sang the old ache. And then the promises, because dignity is a currency even when you are begging. Obedience to schedules, ritual shaped to fit the etiquette of corridors, tribute in the only coin that keeps doors alive, indifference to spectacle in public, songs quarantined to kitchens where love can afford noise. We can see the room where the Triarch's secretariat rehearsed the delivery. A senior scribe smoothed a page that did not need smoothing. It is a habit derived from funerals. A steward read aloud the hinge clause that converted grief into policy. If there are rooms where the sky forgets its appetite, instruct us in their use. If there are routes that cross the sea without teaching it our names, license our feet. If there are remedies that teach marrow to finish a life in dignity, grant us treaties with those remedies. Everyone in the room knew what the answers could be. Nobody spoke them aloud. Speaking aloud in public rooms teaches doors to remember. The envoys left under a canopy of shade that refused to learn pageantry. They wore veils that were instruments, not costumes, each tassel a meter, each plate a promise that the wearer would not educate the light. A child pressed a finger to a sleeve and promised to count the days until the reply. Counting is the first sacrament in houses like this. The cadre later remembered as the Triarch Praetorians lined the route, practicing pause, their art of not giving storms any choreography to imitate. At the last gate, the chief steward recited the prayer that is also a policy. Let neither refusal nor consent teach threshold style. On the other side, the Old Ones met them in rooms that had been trained to be boring longer than most continents have practiced mountain. The stewards of those rooms, apprentices of a discipline so old it has forgotten how to congratulate itself, checked seams for humming, retired a corner that had begun to feel proud of its shadows, and softened the floor so footsteps would not produce memories. The receiving council did not wear crowns. They wore habits. Their hands smelled of ink and of that faint metal taste rooms acquire when maintenance is a sacrament. We must resist the temptation to make the Old Ones cruel in order to explain a grief. Their refusal was not a sneer. It was clinical caution, spoken with a courtesy sharpened by millions of years of watching storms learn names they should not know. They understood that path sharing is not like bread sharing. Bread is eaten, and then regret takes a nap. Doors teach. When you let a new people into a corridor, you are not just letting them through. You are letting them on the fabric of a habit that keeps seas from developing appetites for surnames. Cures behave similarly. Remedies that teach marrow new tricks also teach rooms to expect certain prayers. The act of sharing is not neutral. It is a redesign of climate. So the Old Ones read the petition, and the first reply was a courtesy. We have read you in good faith. The second reply was a map. Your son is a teacher of rudeness. We understand the shape of your request. The third reply was the refusal. We will not share the roads. We will not share the rooms that make storms forget themselves. We will not share the way out. We will share, if you wish, the grammar we teach minds so that storms grow bored of them. We will share the etiquette that keeps doors alive. We will share the quiet discipline of do not let public thresholds learn to be elegant. But the paths are not gifts. They are obligations. Gifts become theatre. Theatre educates seas. In their language, which was the merciful language of audits rather than epics, the refusal came as a set of bland paragraphs with footers that indicated consent to be quoted privately but not publicly. That last clause was the kind of kindness that makes grief worse. The Necrontyr envoys copied it anyway. The senior envoy, who had buried 3 of his own children to a sky that wrote headlines on their skin, thanked the stewards for their attention and asked for the formal stamp that would let the refusal live in a civic memory without teaching doors to believe they are courts. The stamp was provided. Politeness can be barbarous in places where the weather eats names. Imagine the walk back. A courier carrying an answer that was not an insult and yet could not be told that it was not an insult. A city that had scrubbed its corridors into docility to receive a miracle, now asked to learn a more terrible art, to receive a denial in the same key. A triarch who had practiced the tone of mercy so hard that it had become the muscle memory of his officers, told to find a new tone that did not poison the kitchens. The first thing he did, this is not in any record, but it is true because rooms that survive are built by people who do this, was to have a meal with someone who would not tell the walls where the salt had been placed. The second thing he did was to ask for the minutes. Minutes are literature in a people who cannot afford novels in public rooms. The reading of the refusal was scheduled as a civic ritual, not in a plaza. Plazas educate air, not in a chamber. Chambers teach carpets to think. In the stairwells of bureaucracies that hate dignity, in the basements of clinics that love long tables, in assembly halls where the lights have never been allowed to flatter a face, the envoys, one by one, city by city, read the courtesy that said no. They read the reasons. Sharing roads multiplies noise. They read the instruction. We can teach your minds not to fascinate storms. And they read the clause that settled like dust. We will not share a way out. There is a sentence in Necrontyr that has the taste of salt and metal and the sound of a latch. Count refusals. Children had been taught to use it against weather. Now adults were taught to use it against history. The Triarch clerk who wrote the margin note that would change a civilization's posture did not intend to change anything. Counting refusals is training for policy. It is the sort of sentence civil servants write to keep their hands steady. Overnight, it became a theology. Those minutes became the language of their embassies. Every petition that went out afterward bore the fingerprints of that grief, the relentless diction of people who have learned that help will not be handsome when it arrives, if it arrives at all. We should dwell in the Old One's room a little longer, to be fair to a caution that will be mistaken for contempt throughout the aeon that follows. They were not, as the injured will later insist, indifferent to suffering. Their stewards had extracted cities from storms for longer than most elements have enjoyed their current valences. They were willing to share disciplines because disciplines are forgiveness dressed like homework. What they refused to share were shortcuts. Shortcuts alter climate. Shortcuts teach the sea to expect more traffic than is healthy. Shortcuts license appetites to imagine they have occupations. And there was a second concern, not spoken aloud, because speaking aloud makes the sea check its hairstyle in any mirror handy. Some people's inner weather does not match corridors built for other minds. Compatibility is not insult. It is biology writ into architecture. You do not give a toddler a surgeon's knife, and you do not give a civilization a road it has not learned to be dull upon. Even the tone of the refusal was chosen to preserve things the petitioners could not be expected to value, while their dead were so recently dead. The voice was procedural, the sentences short, the verbs humble. In a two-ocean cosmos, certain cadences attract storms like gossip attracts crowds. The Old Ones were expert at refusing cadence. But to a people whose children do not survive to learn patience, a modest sentence can be an atrocity. The envoys did what professionals do when hurt. They were perfect. The return dispatches bore no adjectives. The stamp acknowledging receipt was applied without style. The couriers walked the middle of the route so that the work of future stewards would be easier. Roads remember footprints unless taught otherwise. At the last gate, the chief steward read the clause, that is the ceremony doors. Like best, proceed. The gate obeyed without learning anything. It was the last time a Necrontyr gate did not feel clever for opening. Diplomacy did not collapse overnight. Decency has momentum when trained into wrists over centuries. There were second petitions and third, and then the ones that lawyers write when they have been told to solve what cannot be solved. There were offers the Old Ones might have accepted if the galaxy were a polite place governed by timetables of kindness. Let us lease rooms under supervision. Let us immigrate to places where the light has learned humility. Let us purchase, at prices audited by your stewards, a fraction of an elsewhere, so our children can see 50 without having to be made of law. The refusals that came back were consistent. Consistency is the mercy of a bureaucracy that believes in the future. It is also the most efficient engine of bitterness. And so diplomacy began to curdle, not in words first, but in posture. The Necrontyr stopped speaking in the second person in their minutes and spoke in the third. The petitions addressed to the Old Ones began to sound like petitions addressed to weather. Dear conditions, we observe your preferences. Dear storms, we acknowledge your habits. Dear corridors, we admire your indifference. The Triarch's auditors began to fine eloquence with more enthusiasm than was strictly necessary. The cadre later remembered as the Praetorians practiced a new drill: how to escort despair without letting it teach thresholds. This was not yet war. It was the manufacturing of the kind of silence wars drink when they are thirsty. Within the dynasties, something else turned. Grievance acquired grammar. It is dangerous when grievance learns grammar. Young lords who had learned to measure shade discovered a politics that measured insult. Calendars that had scheduled maintenance found room for committees whose only output was a new tone. A tone can be more revolutionary than a sword. In government corridors that had never allowed rhetoric, rhetorical questions began to be asked in rooms too close to doors. What kind of civilization refuses a clinic to a child? What kind of door refuses to open for a grandmother with a stamped permit called life? The answers were not spoken. The questions were enough. Doors learn from questions too. Across the ledger, the Old One's stewards noticed the change and tightened quiet procedures designed to protect rooms from acquiring appetites. Permits for observers from other cultures were lifted one notch higher in the schedule and padded with 2 more retirements. Demonstrations of corridor hygiene were moved to training halls without echo. An extra baffle was installed in a junction that had begun to collect stories about polite tragedies. When you have tended seas for that long, you learn to smell myth at birth. You add corners, you lower lamps, you speak in lists. You do not congratulate the list for being elegant. Then the first misreadings. They are inevitable when a wound stands opposite a duty. A steward's decision to retire a gate that had begun to attract narratives was interpreted by an envoy as disdain for his people's grief. A Necrontyr junior functionary's meticulous copying of a refusal into civic memory was read by an apprentice of the Old Ones as the beginning of a theater. Both were wrong in a way that teaches weather. The sea loves misunderstandings conducted in good grammar. We can dramatize a lesser meeting because small rooms often matter more. In a maintenance cloister that smelled of solvents and patience, an Old One steward tried to explain to a Necrontyr lawyer why paths are not policy, they are ecology. The lawyer listened with the head tilt of a man who has buried too many. He said, without rancor, "We are not trying to buy your forests. We are trying to rent a footpath to the village where children do not cough blood after breakfast." The steward said, without vanity, "You will not like this answer. Footpaths teach rivers." The lawyer folded the minute into a sleeve that would never betray the conversation to a wall and left. He did not look back because looking back teaches doors nostalgia. This is what it means for diplomacy to curdle. Both men were right in the rooms that trained them. The ocean between those rooms learned a new song. Inside Necrontyr society, the refusal was not experienced as a single event, but as a season. Grief turned into policy fervor. Petition bureaus that once prided themselves on the grammar of endurance began to recruit rhetoricians who could keep public rooms from becoming congregations while still transmitting urgency. Silent charities that had funded filters learned how to fund anger without teaching plazas to perform it. The Triarch, who had proofread the first letter himself, began to attend fewer ceremonies and more clinic audits. He was practicing a new civic faith. Anger must not be allowed to think it is beautiful. There were still diplomats. They did not give up. Some of them even learned the steward's diction well enough to be mistaken for apprentices on quiet planets where the light is polite, but they returned with the same sentences and the same stamps. We will teach minds resilience. We will not share shortcuts. We will supervise the cultivation of compatible habits. We will not rent you elsewhere. And more quietly in notes, never meant for corridors. There are hungers older than your grief. They listen at doors. Your desperation makes you loud. That last line was probably the most compassionate thing anyone wrote in that era, and no one could say it aloud without giving the storm a mirror. First refusals turn into projects. Committees devoted to the ethics of work without witnesses, so grievance would not tutor the weather, wrote handbooks so precise that later generations would misread them as worship. Civic associations published maps of which rooms would be safe for crying. Fathers forbade sons from proposing new prayers in public space. Mothers smuggled courage into lunches and taught their daughters how to read a denial without bleeding adjectives on the floor. The city learned, again, how to make discipline feel like love. On the other side, stewards of the old ones continued their long practice of help that does not flatter. They sent trainers whose faces could not be remembered by walls to show the Necrontyr how to keep processions from educating thresholds. They shared algorithms for distributing festivals to kitchens in ways that improved survival by fractions of a life. They published treatises called things like Considerations in the Deployment of Indifference for the Preservation of Doors, and a note on emotion storage containers in mixed media societies. The Necrontyr copied them, implemented them, and then filed them in cabinets that developed the smell shared by both mercy and defeat. There was, inevitably, an attempt at something halfway to concession: supervised rooms. A proposal was carried across with hands that did not shake. Build us a house on your land where the weather is calm. Let us live in it under your rules. Let us pay in obedience. Let us prove that we can be compatible. The answer returned with the same tone that had become intolerable precisely because it refused to share the feelings of the people reading it. Compatibility is not audition. It is architecture laid into minds across centuries. We cannot rent you a century. We can give you the recipes. We cannot bake your bread. There are refusals that save lives and generate hatred. This was one. There are always saboteurs of patience. A dynastic cousin introduced a motion to publish the refusals with commentary that would have taught doorways the shape of contempt. The motion failed because contempt educates faster than discipline, and the Triarch's clerks were still strong. But the floor learned the word contempt that day, and floors have long memories. In a different district, a priest of the old superstitions, those useful jokes about counterclockwise walking and pebbles in pockets, preached that the universe hates the precise. He was fined for tone and reassigned to count filters. He died counting filters, which is a good death in that city. If there is a pivot, it is quiet. The petitions cease, not because hope dies, but because hope changes profession. What had been diplomacy becomes engineering. The Necrontyr had already studied escape. Now they began to study permission, as a thing that could be manufactured without being requested. If paths cannot be shared, perhaps their seams can be convinced. If cures cannot be licensed, perhaps flesh can be taught to sign a different kind of contract. This is the part of the story where wise narrators lower their voice, because even the suggestion of certain solutions teaches whether to gather its friends. We will not cross the line we drew for this episode. There will be no furnaces here, no names for hungers that enjoy calendars. But we can tell the truth without teaching the sky. A door closed becomes a cause. Causes feed engineers the way applause feeds actors. And in a civilization where applause has been outlawed for public rooms, engineers become the new clergy. They do not wear vestments. They wear gloves. They adopt oaths that sound like safety briefings. They begin sentences with "what if" and end them with "under supervision." They meet in laboratories that have always hated pride and ask pride to wait outside like a dog. Across the sea, the Old One's stewards, who have rescued worlds from worse, add another corner to a corridor that had begun to collect rumors. They mark the Necrontyr file with a color that means train extra apprentices in refusal phrasing for this culture. Grief misreads care. They schedule an audit of a junction that has started to feel like a person. They do not congratulate themselves for prudence. They do not practice prophecy. They simply refuse to teach storms anything with a melody. It is the right thing to do in a dangerous universe, and it is also how tragedies remain polite as they acquire schedules. Back in the city of ledgers, a grandmother opens a sealed memory envelope and removes a photograph that has never been permitted to touch a wall. In it, an envoy stands in a room designed to outlast admiration. Behind him, a steward holds a stamp that has denied miracles with a kindness that makes the mouth taste like iron. The grandmother folds the photograph away and tells a child the sentence that will outlive both of them. We asked. They refused. We will not ask again the same way. The child nods and goes to wash hands in a basin that has learned how to keep courage quiet. We must end without resolve, because resolve belongs to a later, louder hour. The embassies were not failures of rhetoric. They were experiments that proved the materials, that discipline alone cannot reconcile incompatible climates quickly. That kindness delivered in audit diction can be read as contempt when your sky is a tyrant, that roads are not favors and cures are not neutral, that habits save lives and break hearts at the same time. The Necrontyr returned to their ledgers and wrote in a hand that refused to teach the page pride, the line that will become a hinge. A door closed becomes a cause. We end the day with doors unpraised and thresholds intact, a petition filed in cabinets that hate the smell of melodrama, a refusal archived in rooms that keep secrets for a living. The envoys returned their badges to hooks. The stewards retired a corner that hummed. A child counted refusals until sleep taught her to stop at the right number. We do not ask for justice from this hour. We ask only for accuracy. Tomorrow, the grammar of causes will hunt for engineers. The next rooms are louder. We're paraphrasing and interpreting canon, not quoting it. Spine texts and idiom for this segment. Codex, Necrons, 5th edition, for the classical posture of grievance and the pre-war slope toward inevitability. Codex, Necrons, 9th edition, for the procedural rights and rails diction of Triarch order and policy as theology. Craftworld Eldari Eldar material for the steward's ethic that frames Old One caution as corridor hygiene. The Warhammer 40,000 core rulebook for the Materium/Immaterium ecology in which sharing roads is climate, not charity. Early Slan/Old Slan depictions are treated as heritage, not statute. We interpret, we do not copy. History did not lurch toward war. It obeyed its architecture. Put two houses in a two-ocean cosmos, one with clocks that outlive continents and a toolbox that edits weather by refusing to teach it, the other with lifespans that run thin and tools that tire quickly. And you have written a quarrel before either side speaks. Doors and deadlines do not share a grammar. Add the C made of thought, where minds make weather and weather remembers, and you have authored not an argument, but a pressure gradient. It will move what it must. Begin with the asymmetry that governs all the others, time. The old ones owned it in a way that made calendars blush. They could plan in centuries and write the plan in materials that never learned how to brag. Patience is cheap when your species knows how to make mornings that behave for 1,000,000 years. The Necrontyr did not possess this currency. Their ledger, as we have seen, was written in doses and funerals. Their planning horizon had the dignity of a clinic schedule and the cruelty of one too. Decency under such clocks is work, not temperament. Time teaches different virtues to each house. The old ones learned to trust retirements, close a humming seam, add 2 corners, revisit in 5 centuries, because for them, 5 centuries were the distance between breakfast and a late lunch. The Necrontyr learned to trust decisions, move the clinic, copy the minute, argue with the sun by noon, or it will argue with your child first. The old one's kindness expressed itself as a promise to the future. The Necrontyr's kindness expressed itself as action. The two kinds of kindness are both real and chemically incompatible at scale. This incompatibility sharpened when you put tools on the table. The old ones had roads that did not gossip, corridors whose very existence was a mode of refusal. Travel without teaching the sea your name. They had baffles for culture, curricula for public emotion, a library of procedures that kept thresholds humble. The Necrontyr's tools were exquisite in their way. Filters that made air forget its bad habits, ships that converted kilometers into committee meetings, alloys that remembered pressure without teaching rooms to expect hands. But their tools were local instruments in a universe where survival is regional climate control. The old ones could alter weather by refusing to let it learn. The Necrontyr could only alter behavior and hope weather was polite. We can dramatize the difference in a small room because small rooms are the only honest theaters. In a training cloister older than tectonics, an old one steward explains to apprentices the doctrine of retirement. When a junction draws stories, remove it. The sea loves stories. Give it elbows instead. One apprentice, bold in the way that gets you promoted or reassigned, asks, "How long until we reinstall?" The master says, "Until the weather forgets." A floor away, in a Necrontyr planning chamber that smells like tinctures and fresh metal, a magistrate explains a different doctrine. When a window teaches the skin unkind songs, move the clinic by dusk. If questioned, fine your tone. Neither side is wrong. The clock is the quarrel. Time and tools together make policy. For the old ones, policy is a choreography of maintenance. Keep corridors unmusical. Keep doors forgetful. Keep public rooms boring. You can hear the mercy in it if you have enough years in your pocket. Boredom is a kind of heaven when storms are ambitious. For the Necrontyr, policy is the ethics of triage. Purchase shade, ration festivals, turn praise into private currency so that public rooms don't acquire appetites. Both policies save lives. Both policies, when placed across a table, will accuse the other of waste. The old ones think haste is waste. The Necrontyr think slowness is waste. Waste is unforgivable when your dead are recent. Against this human geometry of clocks and wrenches, we must set the Immaterium, which does not care about your calendars or your pride. The sea made of thought does not forgive bad pedagogy. The old ones had centuries to cultivate psychic positive cultures. minds trained to route intensity into containers so that storms find corridors unappetizing. We previewed it earlier, a pedagogy of temperature, songs at home, hums in public, rituals that keep love from leaking into lanes, the sea patrols. The Necrontyr did not grow under such instruction. Their sky punished extravagance with lesions. Their reflex was not to sing carefully, it was to stop singing. Where the old ones taught minds to be compatible with the sea, the Necrontyr taught minds to be invisible to it. Those are not the same lesson. Said another way, the old ones learned to sail the psychic ocean by making their ships uninteresting to the waves. The Necrontyr learned to hide from it under rock and schedule. The moment a conversation about sharing roads begins, you have handed the debate over to the sea. One side says, "We can carry you if you can abide the rules that keep the water bored." The other says, "We do not know how to be carried without making the water curious." Synchronized minds make easy bridges for storms. Discipline keeps those bridges carrying the right traffic. The old ones had discipline embedded in fabric. The Necrontyr had discipline embedded in law. Fabric forgives, law fines. When stress arrives, fines become flags. We have already watched the refusal. The petition was neat, the answer was clinical, the insult lived in the clock. What matters here is how these asymmetries made the refusal inevitable. Not morally, but structurally. The old ones could not risk the sea acquiring a new taste for passengers. The Necrontyr could not wait while their children died to master an etiquette written for minds built to sing in tuned halls. Each house asked the other to become itself on a schedule the other could not meet. In that gap, between eventually and now, between corridor hygiene and children coughing blood, the appetite that wars use for breakfast began to stir. We are not naming it yet. Episode 1 keeps its promise. But appetites respect physics as little as storms do. They gather wherever pressure differentials promise leverage. A species that owns roads, it refuses to lend. A species that needs roads more than it needs praise. A sea that grows louder as civilizations feel more. A sky that writes rashes like obituaries. Put those ingredients in a quiet bowl, and the bowl will begin to hum. Consider how language fails under these conditions. The old ones speak ecology. Paths are not favors. Cures are not neutral. Doors teach. The climate of travel is a closed budget. Every generosity must be measured against the sea's appetite for plot. The Necrontyr speak justice, share the paths, share the cures, share the way out. We will pay in obedience. We will not teach your doors to crave faces. Ecology hears justice and replies, "Not yet." Justice hears ecology and replies, "Not ever." The punctuation is where anger lives. Every asymmetry begets a misreading. The old ones watch a petition and see a people admirable for their restraint, but not yet compatible with rooms that must stay dull. The Necrontyr watch a refusal and see a people indifferent to mortality because their clocks make grief affordable. Both are partly right. Partly right is the most dangerous category in a two-ocean cosmos. It persuades storms to bring friends. We can put the misreading in a hallway where policy gets written. An old one steward posts a notice. Demonstrations of corridor hygiene relocated to Training Hall B. Echo retired. It is an act of love in that house. In a Necrontyr chancery, a clerk posts a notice. Petitions 11 to 19 returned with recipes for compatibility. Roads not shared. It is an act of honesty in that house. The storm reads both notices and hears rhythm. Rhythm is how weather learns to dance. The imbalance in tools becomes more than a budget line when minds begin to dream in hardware. The old ones have roads protected by etiquette so old it has become a property of matter. They own elsewhere as a civic virtue. The Necrontyr own labor, hands that do not need applause, wrists that can turn a minute into a religion, a genius for making rooms unromantic, and a new curiosity about whether the seams between rooms can be persuaded. They have been professionals of permission. Now they begin to study permission without asking. This, too, is structural. If a house denies you a key to a corridor that keeps your child from dying, and if you are honest enough not to break the door for the joy of breaking, you will look for seams that can be talked into cooperation. Engineers here know and translate it into interface problem. We will not say the later words, the names for trespass tools and the furnaces that will teach appetites about bodies. But it is fair to narrate the shift. Minutes change diction. Budgets change recipients. Auditors, who used to fine eloquence for making thresholds proud, now attend seminars where failure modes have new column headings. In a basement that smells of bright metal and old cloth, a team tests whether a room can be convinced that it once had a door where it never did. The experiment is not yet doctrine, but the idea that space is polite if addressed correctly has entered the language. Across the way, the old ones feel the draft. They are better at feeling drafts than anyone alive. A junction in a distant braid begins to collect stories about grief and ingenuity that do not belong in a corridor. Retire it. Add corners, lower lamps. Increase the number of retirements before apprentices see a live seam. In a training text, someone adds a dry sentence whose kindness will be mistaken for coldness. Civilizations under unkind suns require extra latency before exposure to demonstrations. Somewhere, a steward finds himself for tone. Elsewhere, a storm salivates. The warp asymmetry worsens all of this because the sea is not a spectator. The old ones have taught millions to keep public rooms modest, and the sea has learned to be bored in their houses. The Necrontyr have taught millions to withdraw, and the sea has learned nothing about them except that their silence is tasty in a different way. Silence has textures. Some silences say, "We are at peace." Some say, "We are holding our breath." The sea learns both. A culture that holds its breath becomes a bellows when someone violent decides to push. There is another asymmetry hidden inside the warp asymmetry: hope. The old ones can afford the version that says, "The future is the best place for the fragile." The Necrontyr can afford only the version that says, "The present must be made hospitable with tools." Hope, thus divided, manufactures different heroes. The old ones' heroes are stewards who add corners and live to retire them again. The Necrontyr's heroes are magistrates who can move a clinic by dusk. When such heroes stare across a table at each other, they do not recognize the other's courage. Unrecognized courage curdles into contempt. Contempt educates doors faster than love. You may ask whether a third path existed, some treaty in which the old ones supervised compatibility rooms for a century while the Necrontyr paid in obedience and learned to be carried. The answer is in the sea. To make such rooms, you must announce them, and announcements teach whether to count. A corridor that has been labeled safe becomes a story. The sea hears the label and prepares traffic. The old ones judge the risk unacceptable. The Necrontyr judged the delay intolerable. The two judgments are not moral inversions. They are different readings of the same storm map under incompatible clocks. This is the juncture where unifiers emerge in a house like the Necrontyrs. We are not using names, but the office that listens to every ledger and signs the fines for tone and schedules the audits has begun to write fewer apologies to fate and more instructions to workshops. Unification is not declared. It is audited into existence. Provinces with shade baronies are brought back into compliance, not because order is pretty, but because disorder teaches whether to get cocky. A cadre later remembered as the Triarch, Praetorians practices a new drill. How to escort urgency without letting it educate thresholds. The oaths get shorter, the gloves get thicker, minutes begin to taste like steel. Meanwhile, the old ones deepen their caution, where once they taught apprentice stewards to maintain doors without acquiring style, now they teach them to maintain distance without insulting neighbors. It is delicate work. Distance can be cruelty in a house of short lives. Proximity can be fatal in a house that keeps the sea bored by starving it of drama. So they write longer scripts for refusal that contain more recipes and fewer no's, and they train envoys to deliver those scripts with a tone that tastes like nothing. Nothing is a flavor you must practice. Practice nothing can save a galaxy. Practice nothing can also be read as contempt by hungry clocks. Under all this administrative music, the physics of appetite arranges its furniture. The universe contains intelligences that have learned to notice pressure the way a fisherman notices a current. When a people with roads refuses to lend them, when a people without roads decides to invent permission, when the sea begins to lean toward a seam that hums because engineers have started to talk to it, the very light in nearby stars learns a new hobby. We are keeping our promise. We will not speak those names until the next episode. But appetites love a laboratory, and both houses have built a fine one. The asymmetries metastasize into stories told in kitchens and training halls. In Necrontyr kitchens, they could have given us a room. They chose a sermon in Old One training halls. They could have accepted a recipe. They demanded a shortcut. Both are not entirely wrong. Both are not entirely right. In the Immaterium, where stories are a form of weather, not entirely right is as good as a fuse. There is a mercy here, and we should name it before we go downstairs to the furnaces in the next episode. Both houses wanted to live. The old ones wanted you to live long enough to be compatible with rooms that survive storms. The Necrontyr wanted you to live long enough to finish breakfast. That is the same love expressed in incompatible meter. When love collides at meter, it makes sparks. Sparks make workshops. So the workshops warm. Not yet the great furnaces. We will meet soon. No names, no bargain, no steel that remembers souls, but benches. Quiet benches where steepled hands that have learned not to shake draw diagrams of seams. Radio quiet benches where magistrates who can move a clinic by dusk permit themselves a thought they would have fined last year. What if space has a taste for certain words? And what if we can speak them without teaching it to like the sound? Across the galaxy, an apprentice steward walks her last inspection before a junction is retired for humming. Humming is how doors flirt. She adds a corner. She lowers a lamp. She reads the oldest note in her handbook. If the sea learns a rhythm here, remove the place where rhythm is possible. She does her job perfectly and finds herself for the pride that tries to follow. She does not know that 1,000 light years away, a cryptech-to-be is teaching a seam a different rhythm, very carefully, under cloth, with a tone that will not embarrass a wall. She will not hear the other's song. That is what war means before anyone fires a weapon. Two competent women doing their jobs so well that physics becomes interested. And then the last asymmetry, which is not a category so much as a smell, the odor of a cause when it ripens. A door closed becomes a cause. We said it last segment. And the sentence has now acquired calories. Causes feed engineers. Causes recruit lawyers as midwives for machines. Causes teach children to distinguish petitions from projects. Causes get scheduled. The minute that once asked for a road now funds a lab. The audit that once fined a tone now certifies a material that teaches pressure to remember its manners. You can hear the old ones answer tighten as the smell spreads. The sentences stay courteous, but they grow longer. More recipes, more warnings about the sea's appetite for plot, more invitations to adopt disciplines that keep corridors alive. They speak the language of ecology with the gentleness of old people who have watched rivers learn to drown towns that taught them a song. The Necrontyr's replies grow shorter, more numbers, more schedules, more clauses, with by dusk hidden in their muscle. Short and long bounce off each other in the sea. The sea begins to sway. If you are looking for a moment, the kind editors adore, there is not one. War does not begin with a bang in a civilization that has outlawed applause from public rooms. It begins with the appointment of a new undersecretary for laboratories that do not enjoy attention. It begins with a steward adding 2 corners more than usual. It begins with minutes changing their pronouns. It begins with a seam in a room learning that it can be asked a question and that under certain tones it might answer. It begins with patience, instructed to wait outside like a gentle dog. It begins with hope changing profession. We can look up from the benches and the corners long enough to say this plainly. Conflict was baked in because the 2 houses had incompatible interfaces with the 2 oceans. One had time to teach the sea to be bored. The other had no time, and so taught itself to walk with its head down and its hands full of tools. One asked for obedience to corridors. The other asked for corridors to obey. One treated travel as ecology. The other treated it as medicine. Neither was wicked. The universe did not require wickedness to set the table. It required only structure. And because the universe is unkind in literary ways, the furnaces that will soon make appetites into strategies are not in this hour wicked either. They are logical. They are next. A petition becomes a diagram. A diagram becomes a procedure. A procedure becomes a machine that hums a little, the way retired junctions used to hum, and nobody wants to call it music because music teaches doors to dance. But the machine works. When a machine works in a house that has counted refusals long enough, it becomes a policy. When policy can be loaded onto a ship, it becomes an army. In the next hour, appetites will be offered bodies. Elsewhere, solutions will be engineered on purpose. We will not trespass. We will not name the stars that wake when metal acquires memory enough to house a hunger. We will not say what bargain appetites prefer when they are given calendars. We will not open the doors that have been kept so carefully unmusical. We will keep our promise to the first episode and stop with the architecture that made war a budget line instead of a poem. In the next hour, the line item will be funded. The hinge creaks, not because it is rusted, but because weight has arrived. One house with clocks and roads cannot bear to teach the sea a new song. The other house with short lives and strong wrists cannot bear to let morning keep killing children. Between them, the ocean of thought leans, because that is what oceans do when two shores disagree about how to love. A door closed, an appetite awakens. The next rooms are louder.